Ramana Maharshi, How to Surrender to God. Surrendering to God has long been considered a cornerstone of spiritual practice. Across the globe, many traditions regard surrender as the key to transcending the limitations of the individual self and merging with the infinite. Sri Ramana Maharshi, one of the most profound spiritual teachers of the modern age, embraced this path wholeheartedly. He taught that surrendering to God is not only a means to liberation, but is equally effective as self-inquiry in realizing the self. However, Sri Ramana's approach to surrender goes beyond conventional ideas. Most spiritual seekers are familiar with traditional devotional practices, praying, singing hymns, or meditating on God's name. While these practices serve as helpful stepping stones, Sri Ramana pointed out that they address only the surface. True surrender, he explained, goes deeper and requires the dissolution of the fundamental idea of separation, the belief that there is an individual self apart from God. The deeper meaning of surrender. In traditional devotional practices, there is often a subject-object relationship between the devotee and God. The individual views themselves as a separate being praying to, serving, or worshiping an external entity. Sri Ramana, however, emphasized that this dualistic relationship is ultimately illusory. True surrender is not about maintaining this separation, but about dissolving it entirely. For Sri Ramana, surrender means letting go of the ego, the I, thought that claims individuality. It is a process of realizing that the individual self is an illusion and that the only reality is the self, which is infinite, eternal, and indivisible. To achieve this profound state, Sri Ramana offered two main methods. 1. Holding on to the I thought. This practice involves tracing the source of the I thought, the fundamental sense of individuality, until it merges into its origin, the self. Sri Ramana often equated this with self-inquiry, describing it as a path that requires rigorous self-awareness. The process begins with observing the I thought, asking, "Who am I?" Instead of seeking an intellectual answer, the seeker focuses on the origin of the thought itself. Gradually, the I thought loses its grip, revealing the boundless self that lies beyond. 2. Complete surrender. The second method requires relinquishing all responsibility for one's life to God or the self. This is not a passive act, but a total renunciation of personal will, desires, and the illusion of control. The individual must recognize that they are not the doer, and that all actions and outcomes belong to the divine. For surrender to be authentic, it must be unconditional. It is not about asking for favors, blessings, or even enlightenment. True surrender means offering everything, including the desire for liberation, at the feet of the divine. The connection between surrender and self-inquiry. Sri Ramana often explained that surrender and self-inquiry are not separate paths, but two sides of the same coin. Both aim to dissolve the ego and reveal the self. In self-inquiry, the seeker actively questions the source of the I thought, drawing attention inward. In surrender, the seeker passively renounces individuality, attributing everything to God. While the approaches differ outwardly, they converge in their goal, eliminating the I thought and realizing that only the self exists. Sri Ramana emphasized that any practice involving awareness of the I thought is a direct route to self-realization. Overcoming the challenges of surrender. Sri Ramana acknowledged that complete and spontaneous surrender is an arduous task for most people. The ego resists letting go, clinging to its sense of individuality and control. To help his followers, he recommended preliminary practices to prepare the mind for surrender. Cultivating devotion and meditation. One of the most accessible practices is devotion, meditating on God's name or form with love and dedication. This can take the form of japa, repeating a divine name or mantra to keep the mind focused on God. Visualization, meditating on the form of a deity, saint, or guru. By regularly engaging in these practices, the mind becomes absorbed in the divine. This absorption weakens the ego's hold and creates a sense of closeness to God, making surrender easier. The role of grace. Sri Ramana often spoke of the power of grace in the process of surrender. Grace is the divine energy that supports and guides the seeker. When the mind becomes quiet and focused through devotion, it naturally attracts grace, which further weakens the ego and enhances the awareness of the self. Over time, the seeker begins to feel that God alone exists. This conviction strengthens the ability to surrender and erodes the vasanas, the latent impressions that sustain the ego. The final realization, the ultimate goal of surrender, is complete absorption in the self. This happens when the outgoing tendencies of the mind dissolve and the I thought sinks into the heart, the spiritual center of one's being. Sri Ramana described this as a state of pure being, where the ego is completely annihilated and only the self remains. He explained that this realization occurs spontaneously when surrender is total and motiveless. Motiveless surrender. One of the key aspects of surrender is that it must be free of expectations. If the seeker surrenders with the hope of receiving something in return, be it grace, blessings, or liberation, it becomes transactional and incomplete. True surrender is an act of unconditional love and trust, where the seeker offers everything to God without asking for anything in return. The power of the self. In the final stages, the power of the self takes over. Once the seeker has prepared the mind through devotion, self-inquiry, or surrender, the self destroys the residual I thought so completely that it never rises again. This is the state of liberation, where the illusion of separateness dissolves and the seeker realizes their oneness with the infinite. Practical tips for surrender. For those who find surrender challenging, Sri Ramana offered simple yet profound advice. 1. Start small. Begin by surrendering small aspects of your life to God. Gradually, as trust deepens, expand the scope of your surrender. 2. Practice awareness. Regularly observe your thoughts and actions. Whenever you feel a sense of doership, remind yourself that God alone acts. 3. Cultivate devotion. Spend time each day in prayer, meditation, or chanting. These practices quiet the mind and open the heart to surrender. 4. Trust the process. Surrender is not a one-time event, but a gradual process. Be patient and trust that grace will guide you. Conclusion. Sri Ramana Maharshi's teachings on surrender offer a profound roadmap to spiritual liberation. Whether through self-inquiry or complete surrender, the ultimate goal is the same: to dissolve the ego and realize the oneness of existence. True surrender is not about rituals or external practices. It is about letting go of the illusion of separateness and recognizing that God alone exists. By holding on to the I thought, or relinquishing all responsibility to God, we can embark on a transformative journey to self-realization. In the words of Sri Ramana, surrender is to give oneself up to the original cause of one's being. It is to stay quiet and be as you are,